All right, so get ready because we're about to take a deep dive, right? A real deep dive into the life of, well, I guess you could say the one and only Louis Armstrong. But, and here's the thing, this isn't going to be your typical, oh, he played trumpet, he had a gravelly voice kind of thing. We're going deeper, way deeper. We're using his Wikipedia entry as our guide, which is, let me tell you, a gold mine of, well, surprises, to say the least. Like, right off the bat, did you know Armstrong claimed he was born on July 4th, not August 4th?
Which is wild when you think about it, right? It wasn't just some fun fact to him. It was like a statement. Choosing Independence Day as your birthday when you're a black man born in the segregated South.
Yeah.
That's some powerful stuff. Claiming a narrative instead of just, recounting it.
Okay, so let's unpack that narrative a bit. Because Armstrong's childhood, growing up in New Orleans in the Battlefield neighborhood, that wasn't exactly easy street, was it? How did that environment, I mean, we're talking poverty, violence, the works, how did that shape him?
You got to remember, the battlefield, it wasn't just hardship, right? It was this crucible, this melting pot of culture's sounds. It was where Armstrong really cut his teeth musically, soaking it all up, everything from those street performers to the soul-stirring sounds of gospel.
And then there's that story, right, about the Karnofskys?
Oh, yeah? This
Jewish family, they employed a young Armstrong, and he even said they taught him a Russian lullaby.
This story, see, and whether it's 100% accurate or, maybe a little fuzzy with time, it's incredibly telling about Armstrong. The respect he had for the Karnofskys, I mean, they treated him with a kindness that transcended the times, especially back then. He even wore a Star of David that they gave him his whole life. Think about that.
The Wikipedia entry mentions, though, that the lullaby might have actually been, a later Irving Berlin tune. So whether it's a case of, like, mistaken identity or maybe a deliberate retelling, it still shows how much impact this family had on him, don't you think?
Exactly right. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're not just, listing accomplishments here. We're really peeling back the layers, of a life that was lived with intention, a life where music and identity were, totally woven together.
And this is just the beginning, folks. Next up, we're following Armstrong out of the battlefield and onto, get this, the Mississippi riverboats. Talk about a proving ground. This is where he really honed his skills, setting the stage for, well, everything that came after.
And this is where he meets Fate Marable. Now, Marable, he was a band leader, and a strict one at that, insisted on sight reading, discipline, the whole 9 yards. It was a real turning point for Armstrong, forced him to go beyond just natural talent to really develop a deeper understanding of the theory, the structure behind the music.
Talk about a tough teacher. But hey, it obviously paid off because Armstrong, he arrives in Chicago ready to take on the world.
And what a world it was, right? Chicago in the roaring 20s, the jazz scene was exploding, and the city was just buzzing with opportunity. But it was also a city grappling with, let's be real, some serious racial tension. And that dynamic, that's going to play a huge role in shaping not just Armstrong's experiences, but his music, too.
So we've got Armstrong, fresh off the riverboats, lands in Chicago, head full of music, ready to make his mark, and then he meets King Oliver, already a jazz legend. I mean, what was it like for him to join Oliver's Creole Jazz Band?
Oh, man, this wasn't just joining a band. This was like stepping into the big leagues.
Yeah.
Right? You got to remember, Chicago in the 1920s, that was the epicenter of Jazz Oliver's band. They were Armstrong.
He didn't just blend in, did he? There's that story about him practically blowing the roof off during recordings. They had to stick him in a corner 15 feet away just to balance the sound.
That story, it's more than just a fun fact. It gets to the core of who Armstrong was as a musician. That raw power, that energy, it was something else.
It really makes you think, right? How many other artists back then were held back because the technology couldn't handle them? That's wild. But okay, back to Chicago. We got to talk about Lil Hardin, right? She was a fantastic pianist in Oliver's band, became Armstrong's wife, and a huge influence on his career.
Huge, Lil Hardin. She was the one who really encouraged Armstrong to step out, find his own voice. She saw his potential, and man, she wasn't afraid to push him.
And it wasn't just about the music either, right? Lil Hardin seemed to get that stage presence that mattered, especially for a black musician back then.
Absolutely. She understood the game, the unspoken rules, everything Armstrong was up against. She pushed him to be bold, to command attention, not just with his trumpet, but with his whole being.
And it worked. Audiences were captivated. But all this change, this new direction, it caused some friction with Oliver, didn't it?
It did. Oliver, he knew talent when he heard it. But he also saw how Hardin was shaping Armstrong, pushing him toward a more improvisational style, a solo focus that kind of went against the whole Creole jazz band vibe.
So you've got this clash, this tension between the old and the new, and right smack in the middle is Armstrong leading the charge. Which brings us to Well, the Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings.
Revolutionary, that's the word. Those recordings, they were like nothing anyone had ever heard before. Armstrong brought together this small group of incredible musicians and let them loose. Pure magic.
But before we jump into those recordings, let's define something real quick. You mentioned cutting contests earlier. What exactly were those?
Think of it like a musical duel. Musicians going head-to-head trying to outdo each other with their playing. It was competitive intense, the ultimate display of skill.
So high stakes, high energy, sounds electric. But there was more to it than just ego, right? Weren't these cutting contests also a way for black musicians to, I don't know, make a name for themselves in a society that wasn't exactly welcoming?
100%. These contests, they were a way for black musicians to showcase their talent, to challenge the status quo, to demand recognition on their own terms. It was powerful stuff.
It's a good reminder that even when times are tough, creativity finds a way. And for Louis Armstrong, that creativity was about to explode onto the national stage with the Hot 5. Okay, so we've talked about Chicago, right? But it's New York City where Armstrong really becomes, well, Armstrong. What was it about New York that made such a difference?
New York in the late 20s, man, that city was electric. A total creative explosion. And Armstrong, he lands right in the thick of it.
And joins Fletcher Henderson's orchestra, one of the biggest names in the business.
Exactly. This wasn't just another gig. This was the big time. A chance to experiment with a whole new sound.
An experiment he did. He switches from cornet to trumpet, starts really leaning into his vocals.
Which is huge, right? Because this is when vocalists are starting to really emerge in jazz.
Cue heebie-jeebies. That track changed everything. The story goes Armstrong dropped his sheet music during the recording session and just improvised those scat syllables on the spot.
Whether it happened exactly like that, who knows? But it sums up Armstrong perfectly, turning a mistake into magic.
And heebie-jeebies. It wasn't just a one-hit wonder. With the Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings, Armstrong's vocals, they're front and center. It's like this whole new form of musical conversation, witty, emotional, groundbreaking.
Although not everyone was on board with all the changes. Some people thought all that solo improvisation, it was a little much.
It's funny how pushing boundaries can ruffle some feathers. But there's no denying the impact. Armstrong changed the game for every jazz musician who came after him.
No doubt about it. And as time went on, Armstrong, he's not just a musician anymore. He's a cultural icon touring the world, starring in movies.
And let's not forget, he's navigating the civil rights movement, facing criticism from some who thought he wasn't doing enough.
It's the side of Armstrong that's often overlooked. He was walking a tightrope.
Right.
A black man achieving global fame during segregation, trying to find his place in a world that wasn't always kind.
And he wasn't afraid to speak his mind either. Remember when he called out President Eisenhower for not doing enough during the Little Rock crisis?
Exactly. This wasn't just a guy with a trumpet. This was someone who understood the power of his voice and wasn't afraid to use it.
So what have we learned today? We started with a Wikipedia entry and ended up with, well, a whole lot more. A story about talent, ambition, and the courage to challenge the status quo.
We've seen how a kid from the toughest neighborhood in New Orleans became a global icon, and how his music reflected not just his own journey, but the soul of a nation grappling with change.
And that right there, that's the beauty of a deep dive. You never know where you're going to end up. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the music playing.